My name is Benjamin, and welcome to today's video. We're going to be doing my initial ratings for the 2024 presidential election, because I think that's something that I can do very quickly and easily today, because I'm a little bit exhausted after work. Put in closer to 9 hours than 8. Kill me. If you like the content, likes, comments, and subscriptions, they always do help. I do have a link to Patreon in the description. And tomorrow I'm going to be doing a test live stream with the updated internet. And I'm going to be doing a test stream redistricting somewhere. Not sure where yet, but we're going to take a guess at trying to do something fun. So I'm going to go ahead and just go from west to east. I think that's probably a good idea. And generally speaking, from north to south. So we're going to start with Alaska. I'm putting this in a likely Republican category. I think it's just a little bit too soon, even though the Democrats have been improving in Alaska over the past few cycles. Probably should have a toss-up category. There we go. And we're going to use purple for a toss-up. And Nevada is the first state I'm putting in a true toss-up category. And the reason for that is it has been extremely close both in 2020 as well as in 2016. And I don't really see that changing. I think Nevada is kind of becoming more of the perfect example of a swing state than Florida is. And we'll get to Florida. Trust me, we'll get to Florida. Arizona, this is another state I'm putting in the true toss-up category. And that's because I think Arizona is more likely to be, of the two shock flips for the Democrats being, well, when I say shock flips, 4 years ago, if you said Arizona and Georgia were going to go for a Democrat in 2020, I think a reasonable person would say you're crazy. But of those two states, I think Arizona is the most likely Democratic hold. I think Georgia was definitely a shock for most people. Or at the very least, most people who knew what they were doing when it comes to forecasting. Hashtag shots fired. But Arizona is definitely more of the state that I can see staying with the Democrats. Simply because Maricopa County is not as red as it used to be, and you've still got Tucson, which is, I forget which county it's in. It's not Cochise County. Colorado is the first state that used to be a battleground that I'm putting in a safe category. I think the state's gotten too, I think Denver is gotten too big for the rest of the state to even conceive of outvoting. However, there's a difference when we go down to New Mexico. I'm putting it in the likely category, and that's because, well, Trump did surprisingly well in New Mexico. So did the Republicans overall. And we'll see what happens in 2022 during the midterms, but I think New Mexico could be a state that the Republicans have an opening in, simply because it's, unlike Colorado, which has a very high Hispanic population, the white population in New Mexico is much less college educated than in Colorado, and that's a demographic that has been shifting towards the Republicans pretty heavily. And we may see that That'd be enough to at least keep New Mexico somewhat competitive going forward, simply because New Mexico is also pretty darn rural. And then we move on to Texas, and I am actually still surprisingly confident about Texas being a Republican favorable state. And the reason why I'm so confident about it, and actually, these are my confidence margins. Toss-up is a state I can see good arguments both directions. Tilt is, I would still say it's a toss-up, but if I was forced to choose one side, I would pick, the party that I lean it towards. The leans category is, I believe one party has enough of an advantage that they should win most of the time. If the election were held 100 times, they would win, 55 or more times. Likely is basically, I can see an argument that in a landslide it could flip, but it's a very difficult, very, very difficult, and unless something really unusual happens, or something that I just can't foresee because nobody else would foresee it, with any reasonable expectations, it won't flip. Safe is, I couldn't even entertain a serious discussion with somebody who said it would go to the other party, which is one of the reasons why Kansas is safe, even though it's probably going to be within within about 15 points, which is where, when I'm talking about my forecasting model, that is where I put likely. But yeah, Texas is it's getting more competitive. Yes, that is absolutely correct. I'm not arguing that. But Texas was still about 10% more Republican than the nation as a whole. And I don't really see it in a somewhat closer election. I do believe that 2024 will be a closer election with regards to the popular vote. If it's a closer national election, I don't really see Texas flipping. And I still would expect the Democrat to have to win by 8 points nationally for Texas to flip. And I don't think that's going to happen anytime soon. At least, I really don't think an 8% win is going to happen anytime soon. That said, Texas is changing demographically, but I think the Texas Republican Party, unlike a few other Republican parties nationally or across the nation, I think 2020 was a decent wake-up call for them to say, hey, we need, and 2018 was also a wake-up call with Ted Cruz, where they said, whoa, we need to start registering, we need to start turning out, that sort of thing. I think they've got it. I think they got the message. Anyway, we're going to move to Florida, and this is a state I am going to lean towards the Republican Party. And this is actually unusual. Florida used to be the state that would vote for the incumbent, and if the incumbent won, they would flip. If the incumbent lost, they would vote for the new incumbent. And the pattern would continue, where it would basically be you vote for the incumbent, and then you flip parties. So, 92, for example, they voted for H.W. Bush. Bill Clinton won nationally. 96, they voted for Bill Clinton. 2000, George W. Bush, incumbent then flip. Bush is the incumbent, vote for Bush. They flip. Vote for Obama. He's the incumbent now, 2012. They vote for Obama. They flip. They vote for Trump. And in 2020, they voted for Trump. Now, historically speaking, if you followed this pattern, they would vote for Biden in 2024. But I think the Florida Republican Party is putting on a master class of how to turn a perpetual battleground state, a state that's been a battleground for, well, pretty much my entire life. That's been a battleground since 1992. That's actually closer to 30 years. A state that's been a battleground for 29 years. They're putting on a masterclass of how to turn a battleground state into a safe state. And possibly for the first time in a very long time, Republicans might actually outnumber Democrats within 1 or 2 years in terms of voter registration. And if the Republicans are having success while lagging behind Democrats in voter registration, what's going to happen when Republicans in Florida outnumber the Democrats? It's not going to be good. And the Republicans have multiple paths to victory in Florida. Democrats don't. The Republicans can do well in Miami-Dade and be mediocre by what other Republicans would call in the rural areas and still win. They can win the I-4 corridor and the suburbs. They can go that route and win. Winning Duval County, for example, Jacksonville, which is kind of the exception of the Panhandle. The Republicans can win big in the rural areas and do just well enough in Miami-Dade, Hillsborough, and Pinellas County, as well as Duval, and the I-4 corridor and some of these suburb areas, in order to just be pushed over the top. Basically winning the Panhandle, aka the Florida man vote, and doing just well enough everywhere else to be carried over the top. They've got at least 3 paths to victory, or they can mix and match and do even better. And I don't really see how the Democrats overcome this. Obviously, it is still a battleground state. Obviously, it is still extremely competitive. And it can flip. I'm not saying that it can't. I'm just saying the Republicans have better math and better geography in Florida than it would reason to think, especially with a state with 4, possibly 5 major urban areas of Orlando, Miami-Dade, Tampa Bay, Jacksonville, Tallahassee. You can make an argument for Gainesville even. Republicans do better in Florida than you would think, looking at the major cities in Florida. Now we go up to Georgia, and this is the first tilt category, and I'm tilting Georgia to the Republican Party because I think that 2020 was a bit of an exception. Straight up. I think that 2020 is not the new normal for Georgia. I think that the Georgia Republican Party, in the absence of any evidence one way or another, I'm going to err on the side of the party that has historically carried the state. In addition, it's my firm belief that until proven otherwise, if a party gets a wake-up call in a state, kind of like they did in Georgia, they're going to actually learn the lessons from it. And now we're going to move up north to North Carolina. And yeah, this is another state where it really is a toss-up. It's a turnout battleground state. Whichever whichever side can turn out its voters more is going to win. It's just the truth of it. Another state I'm moving into the safe category is Virginia. And I don't think the Republicans got their wake-up call. Or at least they didn't learn from it, because in 2010, they were very successful riding backlash on Obama, and they never learned their lesson when they lost again in 2012, and of course lost Senate seats to Mark Warner and Tim Kaine, and then eventually the governor's race, and I don't think the Republican Party of Virginia got the message that Virginia is changing and that they need to change. We're going to go ahead and go to New England before we talk about where this election 2024 will likely be won or lost, which is the Rust Belt. New Hampshire, by all rights, should be a swing state, and a true toss-up, and I'm putting it there because New Hampshire, like most New England states, is a very swingy state. They tend to vote for whoever they please. You've got 2 Democratic senators, a Republican trifecta in the state government. It's a bit of a wacky state. But that's why we love it from an election forecasting perspective. Maine is actually very similar, but it's slightly more Democratic leaning, and I'm leaning it towards the Democrats for that reason. Suzanne Collins is pretty much a perfect fit for the state. That's why she keeps winning. Now we move on to the Rust Belt, and we're going to go with Iowa and Ohio. I don't want to put them in the safe category because I want to see if it was just Trump or those states really have become that Republican. Personally, I think they really have become that Republican. But you have to make sure you have all the information before you make that call. Pennsylvania, I'm going to talk about this state first, even though I probably should talk about Wisconsin first. We'll talk about Pennsylvania. And this is a state I'm putting in the true toss-up category. It's trended towards the Republicans since about 2008. And before you start arguing about that, I'm saying that it's relative to the nation, it has gotten more Republican each and every cycle. It's a baked-in trend at this point. Part of this is that the rural areas are getting far more Republican than they used to, and the Republicans are doing just well enough in the suburbs of Pittsburgh, in Erie, and they're doing just well enough in the collar counties to where they can could carry the state if they're able to continue the trends in the rural counties, in Pennsyltucky, as it's sometimes called, or the rural T. Obviously, I think the Republican Party would very much like to do better in the collar counties and in the Scranton area, but it's certainly a state that they are getting better. That they are getting better with. Then we'll move on to Wisconsin, and I'm actually tilting Wisconsin to the Republican Party simply because in a year where turnout was insane, Biden carried it by less than Trump carried in 2016 with low turnout. This means that if 2024 has lower turnout than 2020 did, which is likely, I would very much argue that Wisconsin is favorable to the Republican Party. And again, this is a trend that's happening all across the Rust Belt and Upper Midwest, the Great Lakes region. and that the rural areas are less favorable to Democrats than they used to be. And that these manufacturing towns, these steel towns, these coal towns, they aren't they aren't happy with the Democrats abandoning what their core values were. And before any Democrats criticize me on this, do they represent the interests of coal miners? No, they don't. Not from an economic perspective, because the Democrats want to kill off coal. They just do, because they want to abandon coal in favor of green energy. Now, are there alternatives to coal that will keep coal miners employed in the energy sector? Yes, of course. But the Democrats need to actually propose that and talk to coal miners and explain, listen, demand for what you're doing is falling. People just don't want coal anymore. We have a way to keep you in the energy sector with a good, well-paying job. You just have to, be willing to, have it phased into. But the problem is the Democrats are saying, climate change, Green New Deal now. And that's not going to appeal to a coal miner in West Virginia or Youngstown or in the rural T of Pennsylvania. It just won't. Or in the coal towns we have here down in Virginia, in the Blue Ridge Mountains, or in eastern Kentucky. It just won't appeal. And of course, the Democrats going for a very liberal outlook on cultural and social issues, that doesn't appeal to these types of people either. I'm not sure the last time any of the Democrats in chat went through a coal town or through these manufacturing Rust Belt areas, but these people aren't the type who are going to sit down and have an in-depth discussion on the history of segregation in America and racial disparity. They're going to look at a situation and say, treat everybody equally. We don't need to change our culture to do that. We just need to punish the people who don't. And leave it at that. I don't get what you're crying about. It's simple. Quit making it complicated. And, that's the way they talk. They don't, they don't want you going all in on gun control. They might be okay with universal background checks, but these people own ARs. They carry guns. They hunt. And that's, I think, the story of why the Rust Belt is changing from just being, from being a home of legacy Democrats out in these rural areas to a place where the rural areas are voting like they do in the rest of the country. Michigan is the exact opposite. I'm tilting it towards the Democrats. Just because you've got a slightly bigger urban area in Detroit, and you've also got it's a different type of it's different. And the suburbs of Detroit are a little bit more like, say, the suburbs in New York or the DC suburbs, rather than, say, the Cleveland suburbs or what few suburbs exist in Wisconsin. Kenosha area. The WOW counties, as they're sometimes called. And Minnesota, I'm leaning it towards the Democrats. So, definitely a competitive election. I would actually personally argue that Biden should be favored in this map because he can win Wisconsin, he can win Pennsylvania, he can definitely win Arizona going forward, Nevada, and of course, and maybe even North Carolina. But if the Republicans are able to nail a message that will work in the Rust Belt as well as the areas that they're starting to have trouble with down south and in the Southwest, as well as Texas, their path is pretty straightforward. Now, the reason why I'm not talking about Nebraska's congressional district split nor Maine's congressional district split is we don't know what the district lines are going to be. We don't know whether or not the Nebraska Republican Party is going to change the Omaha district to be less democratic, basically have less Omaha in it. And we don't know if Maine's second district is going to be where it currently is, if that makes any sense. Anyway, I'm going to say thank you all for watching. Hope you enjoyed. See you next time. Take it easy. Have a very nice evening.